The morning sun rose sluggishly over Savannah, casting long golden shadows on the cobblestone streets. For many, it was another peaceful day in the coastal city, but for Officer Oliver Evans, peace was a foreign concept. It had been 15 years since his daughter Julia had disappeared, and not a day had passed without the ache of her absence. The case, though cold, burned constantly in his mind. Like an ember that refused to die, Oliver parked his cruiser in the precinct lot and stepped out, his boots hitting the asphalt with a weight that mirrored the burden he carried. His uniform was crisp, but his face bore the lines of sleepless nights and years of anguish. As he walked inside, the familiar hum of activity filled his ears, phones ringing, conversations overlapping, and the occasional burst of laughter from the bullpen. It was routine, almost comforting in its predictability, almost. His office was small but personal. On his desk sat a picture frame, the edges worn from years of handling. In the photo was Julia, just 8 years old, grinning with carefree joy. Around her neck was a delicate silver necklace with a small emerald pendant, glinting in the sunlight. Oliver stared at the photo for a long moment before exhaling deeply and placing it back down. "Morning, Oliver," came a familiar voice. It was his partner, Sergeant Mike Turner, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He leaned against the doorway, his eyes scanning Oliver's face. "You look like hell." Oliver managed a weak smile, accepting the coffee. "I felt worse." "You ever gonna take a break?" Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. Oliver shook his head. "You know the answer to that." Mike sighed. "I figured, listen, we've got a robbery call over on River Street. You up for it?" Before Oliver could answer, his radio crackled to life. "All units. Suspect fleeing southbound on River Street in a black sedan. Possible armed robbery." Adrenaline surged through Oliver's veins as he grabbed his keys. "I'm on it," he said, heading for the door. Without hesitation, Mike followed close behind. The streets of Savannah were bustling with tourists and vendors, their lively chatter now punctuated by the sound of screeching tires. The black sedan tore through the narrow roads, weaving recklessly between cars and pedestrians. Oliver hit the gas, his cruiser roaring as it closed the gap between him and the fleeing vehicle. "Careful, Oliver," Mike warned from the passenger seat, gripping the dashboard as they narrowly avoided a fruit cart. "I've got it," Oliver replied, his focus unyielding. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes locked on the sedan ahead. Finally, the suspect's car clipped a lamppost and spun out, crashing into a curb with a metallic screech. Smoke billowed from the hood as the driver stumbled out, clutching a bag of stolen goods. "Step out of the vehicle," Oliver commanded, his voice firm as he drew his weapon. "Hands where I can see them." The suspect, a wiry man in his 30s with a twitchy demeanor, raised his hands shakily. All right, don't shoot," he pleaded, dropping to his knees. Mike cuffed the man and began reading his rights, but Oliver's attention was elsewhere as he rifled through the suspect's belongings. His eyes caught a glint of green, his breath hitched. There, dangling from the man's neck, was a silver necklace with an emerald pendant. Oliver's hand trembled as he reached for the necklace. The world around him seemed to fade, his heart pounding in his ears. He had seen this necklace before. He knew it like the back of his hand. It was Julia's. "Where did you get this?" Oliver's voice was low but charged with intensity. The man frowned, confused. "What, the necklace? It's just something I—" "Don't lie to me," Oliver snapped, his composure slipping as he grabbed the man by the collar. "Where did you get this?" Mike stepped in quickly, placing a steadying hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Easy, Oliver. Let him talk." The suspect swallowed hard, clearly intimidated. Okay, I stole it. All right, years ago from some woman. I don't even remember where. I just know it was worth something." Oliver's grip tightened momentarily before he forced himself to let go. He stepped back, his mind racing. His chest felt heavy, his thoughts swirling between anger, confusion, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Who was she? Where did you see her? Oliver pressed, though the man shook his head helplessly. "I don't know, man. I swear," the suspect replied, his voice rising in panic. "It was a long time ago." Mike gently pulled Oliver away. "We'll take him in," he said calmly. "We'll figure this out." Oliver nodded reluctantly, though his eyes never left the pendant. It dangled innocently, mocking him with its presence, as they loaded the suspect into the back of the cruiser. Oliver couldn't help but clutch the necklace in his hand, the cold metal pressed against his palm, a tangible link to a past he had never been able to let go. The ride back to the precinct was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle from the back seat. Oliver stared out the window, the city passing by in a blur. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost. Hope. This wasn't over. Not yet. The precinct buzzed with its usual energy as Oliver walked in, his focus razor sharp. Despite the storm raging in his mind, the suspect, Mark Reynolds, shuffled behind him, still handcuffed and muttering under his breath. The silver necklace was now tucked safely into Oliver's jacket pocket, the cool weight of it pressing against him like a reminder. Mike caught up to him as they reached the interrogation room. "You good to handle this?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "I've got it," Oliver replied curtly, his jaw set. There was no room for hesitation now. Mike gave a slight nod. "I'll be watching from the other side," he said, before stepping into the observation room. Inside the interrogation room, Mark slouched in his chair, his hands fidgeting nervously. Oliver sat across from him, placing a recorder on the table and pressing the red button with deliberate force. The room fell silent except for the hum of the overhead light. "Mark Reynolds," Oliver began, his voice steady but cold. "You said you stole this necklace from a woman. I need every detail you can remember. Where? When? What did she look like?" Mark scratched at his temple, avoiding Oliver's gaze. "Man, I told you it was years ago. I don't even remember her face. Just that she was walking down some street in Austin. I saw the necklace, thought it looked valuable and grabbed it, that's all." Oliver leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Austin? You're sure?" Mark shrugged. "Pretty sure. I've been all over. But yeah, I think that's where it was." The mention of Austin sent a chill through Oliver, a city hundreds of miles away, far from Savannah's borders. Could Julia have ended up there? The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. "And this woman," Oliver pressed, his tone sharper now. "She didn't fight back, didn't say anything." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "She yelled, I guess, but I was gone before she could do much. Look, I don't know what you're fishing for, man, but I don't have any answers for you." Oliver clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. He couldn't afford to lose control, not when he was finally getting somewhere. He stood abruptly, stopping the recorder and signaling to Mike through the glass. "We're done here for now," Oliver said, leaving the room without another word. Back in his office, in his tatuiti, Oliver stared at the necklace, the emerald catching the faint afternoon light. His thoughts raced, each one colliding with the next. If the woman Mark had stolen it from was connected to Julia, there might still be a chance to find her, but it was a fragile lead at best, and one that could easily unravel if he wasn't careful. The door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside. Her presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the life they'd pieced together despite their shared loss. She set a paper bag on his desk, a late lunch he'd likely ignore, and sat across from him. "You want to tell me what's going on?" she asked gently, her eyes searching his. Oliver hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I found something today, something that might lead to Julia." Sarah's expression shifted, a mixture of hope and dread. "What do you mean? What did you find?" He placed the necklace on the desk, watching as Sarah's breath hitched. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against the pendant. "This," her voice broke slightly. "This is hers." Oliver nodded. "A suspect had it. He claims he stole it in Austin years ago." Sarah's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Do you really think this means she's alive?" "I don't know," Oliver admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But it's more than I've had in years. I have to follow this, Sarah. I have to." She nodded slowly, though her worry was evident. "Just be careful. I don't want you chasing ghosts." "They're not ghosts," Oliver said firmly. "Not this time." The next morning, Oliver packed a small bag and prepared for the drive to Austin. The thought of leaving Savannah, even temporarily, felt strange. This was his territory, the place he'd scoured for years in search of Julia. But now, his search was taking him into the unknown. Mike met him by his cruiser, a skeptical look on his face. "You really think you're going to find something in Austin?" "I have to try," Oliver replied simply. "Well, you're not going alone," Mike said, tossing his own bag into the trunk. "You're gonna need backup." Oliver didn't argue. Having Mike along would be a relief, even if neither of them said it out loud. The drive was long, the road stretching endlessly ahead as the hours passed. Savannah faded into the distance, replaced by unfamiliar landscapes. Oliver's mind replayed the interrogation with Mark, dissecting every word for hidden meaning. When they finally reached Austin, the city felt alive with energy, a stark contrast to Savannah's quiet charm. Oliver parked near the downtown area and took a moment to steady himself. Somewhere in this sprawling city, he hoped to find the answers he'd been searching for. And if Julia was here, if there was even a sliver of a chance, he wouldn't stop until he found her. Austin's skyline shimmered under the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. The city was alive with a vibrancy that contrasted sharply with Oliver's focused intensity. He stood beside Mike in the middle of the sidewalk, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. For most, this was just another busy day in the Texas capital. But for Oliver, it was a step closer to answers he had been chasing for over a decade. The first stop was a coffee shop near the address where Mark Reynolds claimed he had stolen the necklace. Oliver approached the counter, showing a picture of Julia from years ago to the barista. "Have you ever seen anyone who looks like this?" he asked, his voice even but tinged with urgency. The young woman glanced at the photo, her brow furrowing. "Can't say I have, sorry, sir." She handed the photo back with a sympathetic smile. Oliver sighed, nodding politely, but his hope dimmed just slightly. It was a long shot. He knew that. Still, every no brought him closer to a potential yes. Mike patted his shoulder. "We'll find something. Let's keep moving." The pair spent hours walking through the streets of Austin, showing the picture to locals and shopkeepers, asking the same questions and receiving the same answers. Frustration began to creep in, but Oliver refused to let it take hold. This wasn't just a search. It was a lifeline. By evening, they found themselves in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The air was cooler here, the streets lined with modest homes and old oak trees. Oliver had almost decided to call it a night when his eyes caught something that stopped him in his tracks. A young woman stood by a mailbox, her head bowed as she sorted through letters. She was tall, with long blonde hair that cascaded down her back, and though she was facing away, something about her struck a chord deep within Oliver. "That's her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mike frowned. "What? That's her," Oliver repeated, more firmly this time. He didn't wait for a response. He was already moving toward the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The young woman turned, startled by the sudden intrusion. Her blue eyes locked onto his, and Oliver felt the air leave his lungs. It was like staring into a mirror of the past. Julia's eyes, her features, so familiar yet older, more defined. "Yes," she asked hesitantly, clutching the letters in her hand. Her voice was polite but wary. Oliver struggled to find his words, overwhelmed by the moment. I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Oliver Evans. I'm a police officer. I need to ask you something." The woman glanced nervously at Mike, who hung back, trying not to seem intimidating. "What's this about?" she asked cautiously. Oliver pulled out the photo of Julia, holding it out to her. "This is my daughter. She disappeared 15 years ago. You look just like her." The woman's expression shifted, her brows knitting together as she stared at the photo. No, that's not me. My name is Anna Parker. But it could be," Oliver said, his voice cracking. "Please, just look at the picture. Look closely." Anna hesitated, her grip on the letters tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've never seen you before in my life." Mike stepped in, his tone measured. "We're not here to accuse you of anything, but Officer Evans has been looking for his daughter for a long time. Can you at least tell us a little about your background?" Anna exhaled slowly, her wariness giving way to something softer, curiosity, maybe even sympathy. "I don't know much," she admitted. "I was adopted when I was a kid. My parents told me I was in a car accident before that, and I don't remember anything from before the adoption." Oliver's heart clenched. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Do you remember where you were adopted? Any details about the accident? Anna shook her head. Not really. Just bits and pieces. My adoptive parents said they found me through an agency in Texas, but that's all I know. Do you have any records? Documents? Oliver pressed, his desperation evident. Probably, Anna said cautiously. But I'd have to check. Please, Oliver said softly. If there's even a chance. Anna hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, I'll look. Just give me some time. Later that night, back at their motel, Oliver sat on the edge of his bed. His head in his hands, Mike handed him a cup of coffee, sitting across from him. You okay? Mike asked. Oliver nodded, though his expression said otherwise. She could be Julia, Mike. I know it. She could be, Mike agreed. But let's take this one step at a time. Rushing her won't help. Oliver knew he was right. But patience wasn't his strong suit. After years of dead ends, this lead felt like a lifeline, and he wasn't ready to let it slip through his fingers. In a small house on the other side of the city, Anna Parker sat at her kitchen table, the photo of Julia lying in front of her. She stared at it for a long time, something stirring deep within her that she couldn't quite name. Somewhere, buried beneath the layers of her forgotten childhood, pieces of a puzzle began to shift. The next morning dawned with a pale, silvery light spilling over the city of Austin. Oliver sat in the motel room, staring at his phone. He had barely slept. His mind kept replaying the moment he saw Anna Parker, her face so hauntingly familiar, and the hesitant way she agreed to look for records of her past. Mike emerged from the bathroom, coffee in hand, and gave Oliver a long look, still obsessing. I can't stop, Oliver admitted. Oliver, his voice heavy. She's so much like Julia. If there's even a chance. There is, Mike interrupted firmly, sitting across from him. But we're not going to get anywhere if you drive yourself crazy. Let her come to us. Oliver nodded reluctantly, though his fingers drummed anxiously on the table. He was used to being in control, to taking action, and now he was at the mercy of someone else's timeline. It felt unbearable. Just as he opened his mouth to respond, his phone buzzed. He snatched it up immediately, seeing an unfamiliar number flash on the screen. Hello, Oliver said, his voice catching slightly. Officer Evans. Anna's voice came through, a mix of caution and uncertainty. Yes, it's me, Oliver replied quickly, standing instinctively as if bracing for news. Did you find anything? There was a pause. Then Anna exhaled audibly. I found some old papers my parents kept. There's an adoption certificate and a few medical records from when I was a kid. Nothing about before the adoption, though. The agency's name is on there, if that helps. It does, Oliver said, his heart pounding. Would it be okay if we met? I could take a look at the records. Another pause. Yeah, Anna said finally. There's a cafe near my place. I'll text you the address. Thank you, Oliver said earnestly. I'll see you soon. An hour later, Oliver and Mike arrived at the cafe, a small cozy spot with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh pastries wafting through the air. Anna was already there, sitting at a corner table with a folder in front of her. She looked up as they entered, her expression a mix of nervousness and curiosity. Thanks for meeting us, Oliver said, as he and Mike sat down. Anna nodded, sliding the folder across the table. I don't know if it'll help much, but this is everything I could find. Oliver opened the folder carefully, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. The adoption certificate was the first thing he saw, listing Anna's birth date as just a few months after Julia had disappeared. His pulse quickened. The dates matched. Next were the medical records. They detailed minor injuries from a car accident, including a concussion that, according to the notes, likely caused Anna's memory loss of her early childhood. Oliver's eyes scanned the page repeatedly, searching for anything that might definitively link her to Julia. Do you recognize any of this? Anna asked quietly, her gaze flickering between him and the papers. The timeline fits, Oliver said, meeting her eyes. Your birth date. It's exactly what I'd expect if you were Julia. Anna's expression was unreadable, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. But you're not sure, are you? No, Oliver admitted. Not yet, but there's one way to know for certain. Anna raised an eyebrow. DNA testing. Yes, Oliver confirmed. It's quick, painless, and it'll give us the answers we need. Anna hesitated, her eyes dropping to the folder. I don't know. This is all a lot to take in. I grew up thinking I was just Anna Parker. Now you're telling me I might be someone else entirely. I understand, Oliver said softly. I know it's overwhelming, but if there's even a chance, don't you want to know the truth? Anna glanced at Mike, who gave her a reassuring nod. Then she looked back at Oliver, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she sighed. All right, let's do it. Later that day, Oliver and Anna sat in a sterile clinic waiting room, the air thick with unspoken tension. The nurse had just taken their samples, and now all they could do was wait. Why is this so important to you? Anna asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Oliver turned to her, his eyes softening. Julia, my daughter, was my world. When she disappeared, it was like a part of me died with her. For years, I searched hoping for any sign, any clue, and now, here you are. You might be her, Anna. You might be my Julia. Anna looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I don't know who I am, she admitted. I've always felt like something was missing. But I never imagined it could be this. Oliver reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on hers. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. As the sun set over Austin, Oliver returned to the motel. His thoughts swirling, Mike sat across from him, watching quietly as Oliver turned the adoption papers over in his hands. Think she's the real deal? Mike asked. I don't know, Oliver said honestly, but for the first time in years, I feel like I'm close to something real. Then let's see it through, Mike said firmly. No matter what the test says, Oliver nodded, his resolve hardening. The truth was out there, and he wouldn't stop until he found it. The waiting was unbearable. 2 days passed, each dragging slower than the last. For Oliver, every tick of the clock felt like an eternity, a cruel reminder of the years he'd spent longing for answers. He sat at the motel desk, staring at his phone, willing it to ring. Mike was across the room, flipping through a local newspaper to pass the time. You're going to wear a hole in that table if you keep tapping, Mike said, glancing at Oliver with a smirk. Oliver looked down, realizing his fingers were drumming a relentless beat. He stopped with a sigh, leaning back in the creaky motel chair. I can't help it, Mike. If this test proves she's Julia, she might be, Mike said, his tone calm but measured. And if she's not, we keep searching. You've done it for 15 years. A little longer won't stop you. Before Oliver could respond, his phone buzzed. He snatched it up, his heart racing as he saw the clinic's number flash on the screen. This is it, Oliver murmured, answering the call with a shaky hand. Hello, Mr. Evans? The voice on the other end was professional, though its clinical detachment felt almost cruel. Yes, this is Oliver. We have the results of your DNA test. Would you like to come into the office, or should I give you the results over the phone? Oliver's breath caught. The thought of hearing the answer here, in this dingy motel room, felt too much to bear. I'll come in, he said firmly. Very well. We'll see you shortly. 30 minutes later, Oliver and Mike were back at the clinic, sitting across from a doctor in a pristine white coat. Anna was already there, her face pale and tense, as she fidgeted with the strap of her bag. Thank you all for coming, the doctor began, opening a manila folder. We've completed the analysis, and the results are conclusive. Oliver leaned forward, his entire body rigid with anticipation. Anna's eyes darted between the doctor and Oliver, her own nerves betraying her usual composure. The DNA samples confirm a biological match, the doctor said with a small nod. Anna Parker is, in fact, Julia Evans. Time seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air, both surreal and earth-shattering. Oliver's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat as tears welled in his eyes. He turned to Anna. No, to Julia. And for the first time in 15 years, the void inside him began to fill. It's you, he whispered, his voice trembling. You're my Julia. Anna. Julia stared at him, her own tears threatening to spill. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely audible. You don't have to say anything, Oliver said, his voice breaking. You're here. That's all that matters. And the drive back to the motel was quiet, the air between Oliver and Julia thick with unspoken emotion. Mike, sensing the need for space, rode in a separate car. When they arrived, Oliver sat beside Julia on a bench outside, the warm evening breeze rustling the trees. I don't even know where to start, Julia said after a long silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It's overwhelming. I can't imagine how you feel, Oliver said softly. But I want you to know, whatever you need, time, space, answers, I'll be here. Julia nodded, her gaze distant. I don't remember anything about being Julia. I don't even know who that is. You were 8 when you disappeared, Oliver said gently. You loved painting and playing soccer. You had this laugh that could light up a room, and you always wore that necklace, the one I found. She touched her neck instinctively, as if searching for the pendant. It feels like you're talking about someone else, she admitted. Someone I don't know. Oliver's heart ached at her words. But he understood. Julia had spent years living as Anna Parker, her memories of her life as his daughter erased by trauma. Reconnecting with her would be a journey, and he was ready to walk it with her, no matter how long it took. The next day, Julia returned to her apartment to process everything. Oliver and Mike stayed behind at the motel, discussing their next steps. She's Julia, Oliver said, the words still feeling surreal. My Julia. She is, Mike agreed. But this raises a whole new set of questions. How did she end up in Austin? Who took her? Oliver nodded, his jaw tightening. Whoever's responsible for this, they're still out there, and I won't stop until I find them. Mike leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Then we start digging? Mark Reynolds might not have the answers, but someone does. Oliver stood, his determination renewed. Finding Julia was only the beginning. The people who had taken her, who had stolen 15 years of her life, would answer for their crimes. Meanwhile, in her quiet apartment, Julia sat at her kitchen table, staring at the photo of herself as a child. It felt like looking at a stranger. The little girl in the picture had a lightness about her, a joy that Julia couldn't remember ever feeling. As she traced the edges of the photo, flashes of fragmented memories surfaced. An unfamiliar house, the smell of cookies baking, the sound of laughter. Then, just as quickly, the images were replaced by darkness, fear, and the sound of a car screeching. She gasped, clutching the edge of the table as her head swam. The pieces were there, just out of reach, waiting to be put together, and for the first time, she felt the faintest flicker of hope that she might find the missing parts of herself. The following morning, Oliver was up early, sitting at the desk in the motel room with a notepad in front of him. The joy of finding Julia had been quickly replaced by the burning question of how she had ended up as Anna Parker in Austin, hundreds of miles from Savannah. He was determined to find the answers, even if it meant unraveling painful truths. Mike walked in, carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee. Thought you'd need this, he said, placing one in front of Oliver. Thanks, Oliver muttered, barely looking up. His notepad was filled with scribbled notes and timelines, an attempt to piece together the gaps in Julia's story. Mike leaned over the desk, scanning the chaotic notes. You're not going to figure this out on paper. We need real leads. I know, Oliver said, running a hand through his hair. But something about this doesn't add up. How does a little girl vanish without a trace and reappear as someone else in another state? Someone orchestrated this. Mike nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. And whoever it was, they had to leave a trail. People don't just disappear and reappear without someone noticing. Oliver leaned back, his eyes narrowing as a thought struck him. The adoption agency. It's the only solid link we have to Julia's past after she disappeared. Mike raised an eyebrow. You think they're involved? Maybe, Oliver said. Or maybe they just know more than they let on. Either way, it's a place to start. Later that morning, Oliver and Mike drove to the adoption agency listed on Julia's records. The building was unassuming, tucked away in a quiet part of town. Inside, a receptionist greeted them with a polite smile. How can I help you? She asked. Oliver pulled out his badge. I'm Officer Oliver Evans from Savannah PD. We're investigating a case connected to one of your past adoptions. We need to speak with whoever manages your records. The receptionist's smile faltered, but she nodded. Please wait here. I'll get the director." A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman in a tailored blazer approached them. Her name tag read, Margaret Lane, Director. She extended a hand to Oliver and Mike. "I'm Margaret. I understand you're looking into one of our adoptions." "Yes," Oliver said, his tone professional. "The case involves Anna Parker, who was adopted through your agency. We need to review her records." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Anna Parker, that name does sound familiar. Let me pull the file for you." She disappeared into a back room, returning shortly with a thin folder. Oliver took it, flipping through its contents. There wasn't much: a standard adoption agreement, a few medical forms, and a brief summary of how Anna had been placed in their care. According to this, Anna was brought to the agency after being found wandering near a highway, Oliver said, his eyes narrowing. "There's no record of who brought her in." Margaret shook her head. "I'm afraid not. That was before my time, but from what I understand, the person who found her didn't leave any information. It was quite unusual." "Unusual how?" Mike asked. "Well," Margaret said, choosing her words carefully, "typically when a child is brought to us, there's some attempt to identify their family. But in Anna's case, it was as if no one wanted her to be found." Oliver's grip on the folder tightened. "Do you have any additional records? Even something that might seem insignificant?" Margaret hesitated. "I'd have to check the archives. It might take some time." "Please do," Oliver said. Anything could help. Back at the motel, Oliver reviewed the documents again, searching for anything he might have missed. One line in particular caught his attention. "Child found near Route 183, December 15th, 2007. "That's the same month Julia disappeared," Oliver murmured. His mind racing, Mike looked up from his laptop. "Route 183 runs through some pretty remote areas. If someone wanted to dump a kid without being noticed, that'd be the place to do it." Oliver's stomach churned at the thought. Someone had taken Julia, his Julia, and left her to fend for herself in the middle of nowhere. The anger simmered just beneath his skin. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Julia. "Hey," he answered, his voice softening. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Julia said hesitantly. "I've been thinking about something. I don't know if it's important, but I keep getting these flashes. Memories. I think..." Oliver straightened. "What kind of memories?" "They're blurry," she admitted. "But I remember being in a car, and there was this man. I can't see his face, but I remember feeling scared." Oliver's jaw tightened. "Do you remember anything else?" His voice. "What he said?" Julia was quiet for a moment. "I remember him yelling at someone else, a woman maybe, and then I remember the car stopping, and I was alone." Oliver closed his eyes, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Whoever had taken Julia hadn't worked alone. There was someone else involved. Someone who might still be out there. "Julia," he said gently, "thank you for telling me this. I promise we're going to figure it out." As the sun set, Oliver sat outside the motel, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Mike joined him, handing him a cold beer. "This is bigger than we thought," Mike said simply. "I know," Oliver replied, staring into the distance. "Someone wanted her gone. They went to a lot of trouble to erase her life, and now they're going to pay for it," Mike said firmly. Oliver nodded, his resolve hardening. Whoever had done this hadn't just taken Julia. They had stolen 15 years of her life, and he wasn't going to rest until they faced justice. The air inside the motel room was tense, as Oliver spread out the documents from the adoption agency on the small rickety table. Each piece of paper felt like a fragment of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that was growing darker and more sinister with every step forward. Mike sat across from him, silently reading the same documents, his expression unreadable. "Route 183, Oliver said, his voice low but sharp. "The exact location where Julia was found. If that doesn't scream deliberate, I don't know what does." Mike nodded, leaning back in his chair. "And no information on who brought her in." "That's not just unusual. It's intentional. Someone wanted her off the radar." Oliver's jaw clenched. "We need to dig deeper. The agency didn't give us much. But there's something they're not telling us. There has to be." Mike glanced at him. "And if they don't want to talk, we make them," Oliver said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The next morning, they returned to the adoption agency, the tension between them palpable. Margaret Lane greeted them again, her polite smile more guarded this time. "Mr. Evans, Sergeant Turner," she said, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "How can I help you?" Oliver didn't waste time. "We need access to your archives. Full access." Margaret frowned. "I already pulled everything related to Anna Parker's adoption. If there were additional records, I would have included them." Oliver leaned forward, his voice firm but controlled. "I don't believe that's all there is. Someone brought her in. Someone who deliberately avoided leaving a trace. If you want me to believe there's nothing more, you'll have to do better than that." Margaret's composure faltered, her eyes darting to the side before she regained her composure. "Mr. Evans, I understand this is personal for you, but we follow strict protocols here. If there were more to the file, I would have provided it." "Strict protocols," Oliver said, his voice rising slightly. "Like ignoring how a child was abandoned without any attempts to contact her family. That's not protocol. That's negligence." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Mike cut in, his tone softer but no less insistent. "Margaret, we're not here to point fingers. We're here to find answers. If there's anything, even something small, that you haven't shared, now's the time." For a moment, Margaret hesitated, her resolve wavering. Finally, she sighed. "There is something," she admitted, "but it's unofficial." "What do you mean?" Oliver asked, his eyes narrowing. "When Anna was brought in, there was a note attached to her file. It wasn't signed, and there was no way to verify its origin. We didn't include it in the official records because, well, it didn't seem relevant." Oliver's pulse quickened. "Where is it?" Margaret stood and retrieved a slim folder from a locked drawer. She handed it to Oliver, her expression guarded. "This is everything." Oliver opened the folder and found a single piece of paper, yellowed with age. Scrawled across it in uneven handwriting were the words, "She's better off here." "Don't look for me." The words hit Oliver like a punch to the gut. "Don't look for me," he repeated under his breath. Someone didn't just abandon her. They wanted to disappear. Whoever wrote this knew what they were doing, Mike said, his tone grim. And they wanted to make sure no one came asking questions. "Kids back at the motel." Oliver stared at the note, his mind racing. The handwriting was sloppy, almost hurried, but something about it felt deliberate. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen it before. "We need to cross-check this," he said, looking at Mike. "Every file, every case I've worked on, there has to be something." Mike nodded. "I'll get the database pulled up, but if we're going down this road, it might take a while." "I don't care how long it takes," Oliver said firmly. "This is our first real lead." Hours turned into a full day as Oliver and Mike sifted through records. They compared handwriting samples from case files, suspect reports, and even old personal documents Oliver had brought from Savannah, but nothing matched. It wasn't until late that night, when Mike stepped away to grab dinner, that Oliver found something in an old box of documents he'd brought from home. Tucked beneath years of forgotten paperwork was a note written by Ethan Morgan, his former partner. Oliver's hands shook as he held the two pieces of paper side by side. The handwriting was nearly identical. The slant, the loops on the letters, it all matched. "No," Oliver whispered, his chest tightening. "It can't be," Mike returned moments later, a bag of takeout in hand. He froze when he saw the look on Oliver's face. "What is it?" Oliver handed him the papers silently, his throat too tight to speak. Mike scanned them, his expression darkening. "Ethan," Mike said, his voice heavy. "Your old partner." Oliver nodded, his mind reeling. Ethan Morgan had been his closest ally during the initial search for Julia. He had been there through every dead end, every failed lead. The idea that Ethan could have been involved, let alone responsible, was almost too much to process. "We need to find him," Oliver said, his voice hard. "Now." As the realization set in, Oliver's thoughts raced back to his last conversation with Ethan. Years ago, he remembered the man's cryptic comments about how some cases were better left closed, how searching too hard for answers could bring more pain than peace. The truth was finally clear. Ethan hadn't just been a bystander. He had been the orchestrator, and now Oliver was determined to confront him, no matter the cost. The revelation that Ethan Morgan had a hand in Julia's disappearance was a bitter pill for Oliver to swallow. The man he once trusted as a partner and a friend had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. Sitting in the motel room with Mike, Oliver clenched his fists. The note from the adoption file crumpled between his fingers. Mike broke the tense silence. We need to tread carefully. If Ethan's behind this, he's not going to roll over and confess. He knows the system as well as you do. Oliver nodded, his jaw tight. I don't care how careful we have to be. He's been hiding for 15 years. That ends now. The next morning, Oliver and Mike began their search for Ethan. He had left the force shortly after Julia's disappearance, citing burnout and personal reasons. Since then, his whereabouts had been sporadic. With little more than a trail of outdated addresses and disconnected phone numbers, Mike leaned back in his chair, scrolling through a database on his laptop. Last known address puts him in Galveston, working as a private investigator, but that was 3 years ago. Oliver's lips pressed into a thin line. He won't be easy to find. He's had years to cover his tracks. Mike glanced at him. You think he's still in Texas? He wouldn't stray too far, Oliver said, his tone resolute. He'd want to stay close enough to keep an eye on things. And hours later, they hit their first break. One of Ethan's former clients had listed him as an emergency contact on a court filing 6 months earlier. The address was in a small town just outside Austin. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead they had. The drive was tense, the silence in the car broken only by the occasional hum of the tires on the highway. Oliver's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. Every mile brought him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for, but knew was necessary. When they arrived, the house was modest, tucked behind overgrown bushes and flanked by 2 ancient oak trees. It looked like the kind of place someone would go to disappear. Mike reached for his gun holster as they approached the door. Let's be smart about this. Oliver nodded, though his heart was pounding. He knocked firmly on the weathered wood, the sound echoing in the stillness of the quiet street. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open just enough for a face to appear. Older, thinner, but unmistakably Ethan Morgan. Ethan's eyes widened when he saw Oliver. Well, this is a surprise, he said, his voice laced with a mix of unease and forced nonchalance. What brings you here after all these years? Oliver's voice was cold, razor sharp. We need to talk. Ethan hesitated, then opened the door wider. Come in. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished. With stacks of papers and files cluttering every surface, Ethan motioned toward the couch, but Oliver didn't sit. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, his gaze locked on his former partner. You were there, Oliver began, his voice low but steady. You were there when Julia disappeared. You helped me search for her. You pretended to care. Ethan stiffened. What are you talking about? Oliver pulled the note from his pocket and held it up. The handwriting's yours. Don't try to deny it. Ethan's face paled slightly, but he kept his composure. I don't know what you're accusing me of, Oliver, but you need to be careful. Throwing around baseless accusations. Don't! Oliver snapped, his voice rising. Don't you dare lie to me. I know what you did. You took her. You orchestrated everything. Ethan's expression darkened, the pretense of innocence slipping away. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain this, Oliver said, tossing the note onto the table. Explain how my daughter ends up in an adoption agency with a message written in your handwriting. Explain why you disappeared right after I started getting close to answers. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning against the wall. You don't understand. Then make me understand, Oliver shouted, his voice filled with years of pain and anger. Ethan's eyes flashed with something between regret and defiance. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You don't know the pressure I was under, the people I owed. They wanted leverage against you and Julia. She was just supposed to be a tool, but then it got out of hand. Oliver's fists clenched. Out of hand, she's not a tool. She's my daughter. Ethan looked away, unable to meet Oliver's piercing gaze. I didn't want to hurt her, I thought. I thought if I sent her far enough away, it would keep her safe. That's why I left her at the agency. Oliver's breath caught, his chest heaving with emotion. You ruined her life. You ruined mine. And for what? To save yourself. Ethan didn't answer, his silence damning. Oliver took a step closer, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "You don't get to walk away from this." Mike, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Ethan, you're going to face justice. You can cooperate, or we can make this official right now." Ethan's shoulders sagged, and he nodded slowly. "I'll cooperate." But Oliver wasn't convinced. The fire in Ethan's eyes told him this wasn't over. Not yet. Back at the motel that night, Oliver sat on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The confrontation with Ethan had left him raw, but it wasn't enough. Ethan's admission had raised more questions than it answered. Who were the people he had been working for? How deep did the conspiracy go? Julia's face flashed in his mind, her hesitant smile as she tried to piece together the fragments of her stolen childhood. He owed it to her to keep fighting, to uncover the full truth. "This isn't over," Oliver said aloud, his voice firm. "No," Mike agreed from across the room. "But it's a start." The atmosphere in the motel room was heavy. Oliver sat at the edge of the bed, the events of the day replaying endlessly in his mind. Ethan's words had given him a bitter taste of the truth, but there were still too many questions unanswered. The people Ethan claimed to have owed. Who were they? And why had they targeted Julia? Mike paced near the window, his movements restless. "Ethan cooperating doesn't mean much if he's only feeding us scraps," he said, breaking the silence. "We need the whole story." Oliver nodded, his jaw set. "We push him harder. He knows more than he's letting on." Before Mike could respond, Oliver's phone buzzed on the bedside table. He grabbed it quickly, his heart skipping when he saw Julia's name. "Julia," he answered, his voice softening. "Everything okay?" "Not really," Julia replied, her voice shaky. I think someone's been following me." Oliver shot to his feet. "What? Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm at my apartment," she said. Her words rushed. "I saw a car parked outside earlier. It was there for hours. And then when I went to the store just now, I felt like someone was watching me." "Stay where you are," Oliver said firmly. "Lock the doors. I'm coming." The drive to Julia's apartment felt like an eternity. Oliver's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Beside him, Mike was already dialing the local police, coordinating backup in case the situation escalated. When they arrived, the street was quiet, but Oliver's instincts were on high alert. He parked quickly, scanning the area for anything unusual. Julia was waiting just inside the door, her face pale and anxious. "Dad?" she said softly, the words still unfamiliar but comforting as it left her lips. Oliver embraced her tightly, his relief tempered by concern. "Are you okay? Did you see anyone else?" Julia shook her head. "Not since I got back, but I swear, someone was out there earlier." Oliver turned to Mike. "Check the perimeter. Look for anything out of place." Mike nodded and disappeared into the night. Oliver guided Julia to the couch, his hand never leaving her shoulder. "Tell me everything," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It started this afternoon," Julia began. "I noticed the car when I was leaving for work. I thought maybe it was a neighbor, but it didn't move all day. And when I went to the store, I could feel someone watching me. I don't know how to explain it. It was just this feeling." Oliver's fists clenched. "You did the right thing by calling me. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Just then, Mike returned, his expression grim. "I found tire tracks in the alley behind the building. Looks like someone was parked there recently." Oliver's mind raced. They're watching her. Whoever Ethan's working for. They know we're getting close. Mike nodded. "We need to move her. This place isn't safe." And by midnight, Julia was settled in a room at a secure location, a small house on the outskirts of town that Mike had arranged through a trusted local officer. She was reluctant to leave her apartment but understood the necessity. Oliver sat with her in the small living room, the tension between them palpable. "I know this is a lot," he said gently, "but I need you to trust me. These people, they won't stop. Not until we find out who they are." Julia nodded, her eyes wide but resolute. "I do trust you. I don't understand why this is happening. Why me?" Oliver's heart ached at her words. "Because someone thought they could use you to hurt me. But they underestimated both of us." The next day, Oliver and Mike met Ethan again, this time in an interrogation room at a local station. The walls felt suffocating, the air thick with tension as Oliver leaned across the table. "You said they wanted leverage," Oliver began, his voice cold. "Who are they? Names? Faces?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to Mike before settling on Oliver. "It was a group," he said finally. "They worked in trafficking. Kids, women, anything they could make money off of. I got in too deep. I owed them favors, money, they saw you, your reputation, or your family, and they saw an opportunity." Oliver's jaw tightened. "And you handed them my daughter." "I didn't have a choice," Ethan said defensively. "They were going to kill me." "You had a choice," Oliver snapped, "and you chose yourself." Ethan's silence was damning. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Their leader. He's still active. I don't know where, but I can give you names, contacts. It's all I have." "Then start talking," Oliver said. Ethan listed names and locations, his words spilling out in a mix of guilt and desperation. Each name was a piece of the puzzle, and Oliver committed them to memory, his determination growing with every detail. Then that night, back at the safe house, Oliver sat with Mike, reviewing the information Ethan had provided. The names were unfamiliar, but they represented a network, a web of people who had taken Julia and left her to disappear. "This is it," Oliver said quietly. "We take this to the task force, and we bring them down." Mike nodded. "But we need to move fast. If they know we're onto them, they'll try to disappear." As they planned their next move, Oliver's phone buzzed again. It was Julia. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone's outside." Oliver's blood ran cold. "Stay inside. Don't open the door. I'm on my way." Oliver's tires screeched as he turned the corner onto the quiet street where Julia's safe house stood. His heart thundered in his chest as he glanced at Mike, who was already securing his weapon. "This has to be them," Mike said grimly. "They've made their move." Oliver didn't respond. His jaw was tight, his focus laser sharp. He parked the car a block away, cutting the engine to keep their approach silent. The safe house sat in the middle of the street, its curtains drawn, and a single dim light visible through the living room window. Julia was inside, alone and vulnerable. As they approached the house on foot, Oliver spotted the silhouette of a figure lurking near the side of the property. The man's posture was tense, his head swiveling as if scanning for movement. Mike motioned silently, indicating he would circle around to the back. Oliver nodded, gripping his weapon tightly as he moved closer to the front door. His mind raced with scenarios, none of them good, but he pushed the fear aside. He had to be calm, for Julia. Inside the house, Julia pressed her back against the wall, clutching her phone in one hand and a makeshift weapon, a kitchen knife in the other. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears. She'd heard the sound of footsteps outside, faint but unmistakable. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. Her phone buzzed with a message from Oliver. "I'm here. Stay where you are. We're coming in." Relief mixed with fear. She wanted nothing more than to run into her father's arms. But she forced herself to stay put. He had warned her not to make a sound, and she trusted him completely. Oliver reached the front door, his movements quiet and deliberate. He crouched low, peering through the small window to the side. The living room was empty, but a shadow shifted against the curtains. Someone was already inside. Mike's voice crackled softly through Oliver's earpiece. "Two in the back, armed, moving now." "Copy that," Oliver whispered. "I'm taking the front." Drawing a deep breath, Oliver tested the door handle. It was unlocked. Slowly, he pushed the door open, the faint creak of the hinges sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. The living room was eerily quiet, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. He moved carefully, his steps silent as he advanced down the hallway. Suddenly, a noise, soft but distinct, came from the kitchen. Oliver raised his weapon, every nerve in his body on high alert. In the back of the house, Mike approached the two men who had positioned themselves near the rear entrance. One was crouched near a window, peering inside, while the other stood guard, a firearm tucked at his side. "Police!" Mike barked, his weapon trained on them. "Hands up!" The men spun around, startled, but one made the mistake of reaching for his gun. Mike fired a warning shot into the ground. "I said hands up now!" The men hesitated for a moment before reluctantly raising their hands. Mike quickly secured them. radioing for backup as he did. "Back's clear," he reported to Oliver. 2 in custody. In the kitchen, Oliver moved toward the source of the sound. The refrigerator door was slightly ajar, casting a faint glow on the floor. As he rounded the corner, a figure lunged at him from the shadows. Instinct took over, and Oliver deflected the blow, grappling with the attacker as they crashed into the table. The man was strong, his movements calculated. He swung a crowbar, narrowly missing Oliver's head. Oliver retaliated with a sharp jab to the man's ribs, forcing him to stumble back. The momentary advantage allowed Oliver to disarm him, sending the crowbar clattering to the floor. "Who sent you?" Oliver demanded, pinning the man against the counter. The attacker smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think you're going to stop us? This is bigger than you." "Try me," Oliver growled, slamming the man against the counter again. "Who sent you?" The man's smirk faltered, but before he could answer, Mike entered the room, his weapon drawn. "Everything okay?" "Got him," Oliver said, his breathing heavy. He turned back to the man. "You're going to tell me everything, or so help me." A sudden noise from the living room cut him off. Oliver's blood ran cold. Julia. Rushing back into the living room, Oliver found Julia standing frozen, her knife clutched tightly in her hand. Another man had entered through the front door, his gun aimed directly at her. Oliver acted on instinct, raising his weapon. "Drop it," he shouted, his voice commanding. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Oliver and Julia. "You take one more step and she's dead," he threatened. "Don't do this," Oliver said, his tone steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You don't want this ending on your head," the man sneered, but faltered slightly as Julia's eyes met Oliver's. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Oliver saw his opening. In a single swift motion, he fired, hitting the man in the shoulder. The gun clattered to the floor as he cried out in pain, collapsing to his knees. Julia ran to Oliver, who wrapped her in a protective embrace. "It's okay," he murmured, holding her tightly. "You're safe now." As the police swarmed the scene, arresting the attackers and securing the area, Oliver stood outside with Julia and Mike, the night air cool against his skin. Julia clung to him, her grip firm as if afraid to let go. "You did good," Oliver said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You stayed strong." Julia nodded, her tears spilling freely. "I was so scared." "I know," Oliver said, his voice filled with emotion. "But it's over now. They won't hurt you again." Mike approached, his expression grim but satisfied. "We've got them all, and with Ethan's intel, this is enough to dismantle their operation." Oliver nodded, his focus solely on Julia. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like he could finally protect her, not just as a father, but as a man who had fought to bring her home. The morning after the raid dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Oliver sat in the precinct's interrogation room, his gaze locked on Ethan Morgan, who sat across from him in handcuffs. Ethan's usually smug demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a hollow silence. "Tell me why?" Oliver said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "Why did you do it, Ethan? Why my daughter?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding Oliver's. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "I told you. It was them. They wanted leverage. You were the perfect target." Oliver slammed his fist on the table, making Ethan flinch. "You had a choice. You could have come to me. We could have fought them together. But instead, you stole my daughter and left her to disappear." Ethan finally met Oliver's gaze, his expression grim. "You think it was easy. You think I wanted to do it. They had me cornered, Oliver. It was either give them Julia or lose my own family." Oliver's jaw tightened. "You don't get to justify this. You don't get to make yourself the victim. You destroyed my life, Ethan. You destroyed hers." Ethan looked down, defeated. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." "It's not worth anything," Oliver snapped, rising to his feet. "You're going to prison, Ethan, and I'll make sure you stay there for the rest of your life." Outside the interrogation room, Mike was waiting with a folder in hand. "We've got everything we need," he said. "The intel Ethan gave us ties directly to the trafficking ring. The task force is already making arrests." "Good," Oliver replied. his voice resolute. "This ends now." As they walked through the precinct, Mike glanced at him. "What about Julia? How's she holding up?" Oliver's expression softened. "She's strong. Stronger than I ever imagined. But it's going to take time. 15 years doesn't just vanish overnight." Later that day, Oliver returned to the safe house where Julia was waiting. She was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm sun. When she saw him, she stood, her face lighting up with relief. "Is it over?" she asked hesitantly. Oliver nodded, stepping closer. "It's over. The people who did this, they're being brought to justice." Julia exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "I still can't believe this is real. That you're here. That I'm..." "Julia," Oliver reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're more than just a name. You're my daughter. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." She smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever remember everything, but I want to try. And I'll be here," Oliver said firmly, every step of the way. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm. Julia moved into a small house near Oliver's, and their days were filled with long conversations, old photo albums, and tentative steps toward rebuilding their relationship. Though the memories of her childhood remained elusive, Julia found comfort in the stories Oliver shared, each one a thread reconnecting her to the life she had lost. Mike stopped by often, bringing updates on the investigation. The trafficking ring had been dismantled, its members facing lengthy prison sentences. Ethan Morgan, too, was convicted, his betrayal serving as a stark reminder of the darkness that had once clouded Oliver's life. One sunny afternoon, Oliver and Julia stood in a park near the Savannah waterfront. Children played on the swings, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Julia held a small photo in her hands, a picture of her as a child, wearing the emerald necklace that had brought her back to her father. "It's strange," she said, her voice quiet. "I look at this, and I feel like I should remember, but it's like there's a wall in my mind." Oliver placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Memories or not, you're here now. That's all that matters." Julia smiled, her gaze lifting to meet his. "Thank you for never giving up on me." "I couldn't," Oliver said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my daughter, and no matter how long it took, I always knew I'd find you." They stood there for a while, watching the world move around them. For the first time in years, Oliver felt a sense of peace. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He had found Julia, he had his family back, and that was enough.